And we're going live.
Okay.
Aloha, and thank you for joining us at Kids Hurt 2 Hawaii. This is Inside Times. We call it Inside Times because these are times that we have to spend inside. Although we have some freedoms now to walk and hike and surf and swim, which can be very helpful when you're inside a lot. So these are, silence your phone please. This is Hiro Ito. I'm Cynthia White. Hiro's going to be giving me your questions today. If you have questions, you can type in text questions and he'll be reading them so that I can answer those questions. So thank you for joining us. Today our topic is grief and loss. So for the first 3 sessions we talked about trauma. So that's a lot of information in just 3 hours of time. This time we're going to talk about grief, and there's a lot of information to cover too. So the next 3 sessions will be on grief. Today we're going to look at grief and development, loss and the various kinds of losses, and just talk about grief in general. So if you have questions, please text your questions and Hiro will read your questions and I'll do my best to answer them.
Felicia is watching.
Felicia, thank you for joining us.
Felicia.
And Irene and Uchi, it's good to know that we're in touch in some small way. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I think I've solved my technical problems. It was about slow internet, and
Good
I guess
job.
everybody's internet is slow these days because we're all sharing the same bandwidth. And so now that I've got that fixed, hopefully we'll be able to do this presentation while you're able to see the voice behind the words. So, okay, here we go. So we're going to start our presentation. So first of all, there is a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with all of you. And I'll get it set up. So Inside Times is presented to offer you grief and trauma resources for our families. We know these are tough times, so we hope this will be helpful. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about grief. What is grief and why do we grieve? Well, first of all, we grieve when we have a loss. Loss is change. Any change, even a positive change, evokes the grief process. We grieve anytime we have a loss, getting married, graduating, or in this case, not getting to attend your graduation. That's a loss. That's a big loss. Having a child, these are all changes, and they're happy changes, but they also create some grieving in our lives. There are different types of grief. Let's go here. Oh, I'm going to talk about the different types of grief later. There are historical perspectives, and I'm going to talk about the different types of losses too. And so let's first talk about types of losses. Tangible losses. Tangible is something we can see, touch, smell, hear, that we can perceive through our senses. So tangible losses include death, of course. Types of death. There are different types of deaths and different reactions to different types of death. So let's talk a little bit about some of the types of deaths. So deaths can be from an illness. Deaths can be a violent death, like a homicide or car crash. Could be from a suicide. And let me say a little bit about suicide at this point in time. I want to talk about it because I think we have a lot of misinformation and lack of understanding of suicide. First of all, you should never say committed suicide, because to say committed means it's an act of will. And that is a misrepresentation of suicide. Suicide is not an act of will. As a matter of fact, when a person suicides, they no longer have a will. It's important to understand that suicide is a terminal cause of a brain illness. The brain itself is an organ, but it's the organ of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And so it looks like a person who suicides is making a choice. It looks like it's part of their will, but at that point in time, they have lost the capacity for choosing freely. They are responding to an impulse. And what's happened is because of the illness process in the brain, they lose their capacity for impulse control. There's an area in our brain, it's like right smack dab in the center of our brains. It's a walnut size part of our brain, and it's what controls impulses. And it's usually that area of the brain that's affected that causes a person to lose their capacity to act on an impulse, and thus suicide is a consequence of that loss of capacity. An interesting part about suicide is that a person can never have any symptoms, can appear perfectly healthy and normal, and then suddenly their suicide is taken everybody by surprise. They didn't know it was coming, they didn't know there was anything wrong, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that a lot of times when people have brain illnesses, there's a lot of stigma around mental illness or our mental health in general. So we don't like to talk to people about the fact that our brains aren't working well. We're suffering from that part of our brain that isn't working well. And so they hide it. It can also be that they themselves don't realize that something is happening. And it's just as big a surprise to them as it is to everyone else. So suicide can be kind of like a heart attack. You can have symptoms and be treated for those symptoms. And without treatment, you may die of a heart attack. But with treatment, you will more likely live longer. Or it can be that you have a problem with your heart, but you don't even know it. And you're out jogging one day and just suddenly your heart gives out. So suicide is like that. Our brain is an organ, just like our heart is an organ. And it's that we can not even know there's anything wrong ourselves and then suddenly have this overwhelming pain, agony, psychological, emotional agony, and lose our capacity to control the impulse to end that through death. So again, let's remember and try to understand that suicide is a terminal consequence of a brain illness. And sometimes we can help, sometimes we can't. Sometimes a person will get help for themselves. Sometimes they don't know they need help. And they try to go it alone and tough it out. And then suddenly they lose that capacity to control the impulse to relieve their suffering. So that's a type of death, though, and many deaths will have different kind of reactions from people. You know, like a homicide has a different response than a suicide or an illness or a heart failure. So how a person dies is going to affect how a person grieves. Divorce is a tangible loss. We know that when people divorce, they have a loss. And there are many losses associated with that. And yes, Cheryl just pointed out, a sudden death is much different from a death that we know is coming or expecting death. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross used to tell me that all deaths are sudden, but some deaths are expected and others are unexpected. So yes, true. The unexpected or expected death does evoke a different kind of process and requires different kinds of grieving, grief work, if you will. I like to talk about grief work, and you'll hear me talk about that a lot more as we move along. So, Harold, is there a question that somebody's asking?
There's a question. The Tanya asking, what are tools that can be used in crisis?
Well, that's a great question, and that's a very long answer, and I'll actually talk about tools in our third session, which is not this time, not next time, but the time after next. I'll talk about some very specific, easy-to-learn tools. So thank you for that question, and sorry I'm going to wait and answer that in one of the next presentations. Divorce is a loss. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but that divorce is harder on children than the death of a parent. And the reason for that is that after divorce, children may go through a lot of changes. They may move, their economic levels change, they may share homes, going back and forth, they may have to change schools. So the real factor in how children cope with loss is how many changes they experience. And the higher level of change, the more difficulty they're going to have. And divorce often leads to higher changes, more frequent, not more frequent, but more changes in general. Other losses, separation, children who are separated from a parent because of drug abuse, abandonment, domestic violence. That's a huge loss, and they end up living in foster care or kinship care or go into adoption. That's a huge loss. A lot of times children aren't given the opportunity to grieve after a separation, and we just think, oh, they're okay. And I'll explain why we think children are okay when they're grieving later on. But for now, please understand that separation is a huge loss for children. Even if it's temporary, they still go through a very profound grieving process. Loss of a limb, I think that's tangible. We know, we can look at you, we can see, you can see that there is a loss there. Loss of health. That is something that people don't often understand, that it is a grieving process. So when somebody is ill, they go through a surgery, they go through a long illness, even a short-term illness. There's a big loss of health to that. And I know that a lot of people who have contracted the COVID-19 virus have suffered some very difficult health outcomes as a result of that. Apparently, it's a long-term healing process. So loss of health is something that we grieve. Loss of objects like your home, like your car. Sometimes I talk about our reaction to loss in terms of if you lost $1, how you would have a reaction. You'd be like, oh, where's my dollar? I want to find my dollar. Or if you lost $10, then you'd be like, uh-oh, I've lost $10. If you lost $100 or $1,000, then you start to see that there's going to be a higher intensity to your reaction to that loss. But objects, we can be very attached to objects, to our homes, to our cars. If we have a car crash, and our car is destroyed, that can be a loss. For children, loss of their favorite toy, loss of their ice cream cone falling on the ground. So
playtime outside.
Well, now we have, those are what I'm coming to. Those are what we call intangible losses. Of course, I didn't talk about loss of pets. I should have put loss of pets up there because I think we all know that can be very difficult for people. Pets are like family to us, and so that's the loss of a pet, either if they run away or if they die or if they're killed. Those are differences in terms of how we're going to react to those losses. But loss of a pet, I've had many pets die, and that's been very difficult for me, I know. Now, let's talk about intangible losses. Intangible losses are things you can't see, touch, taste, hear, feel. those are losses that you experience, but nobody else may recognize those losses. For example, loss of hopes. It's like when you go through a divorce, you had a hope that that would last forever, that you would be a family, and then the family is broken apart, and your hope for being together forever and having that family, that can be a real loss. It's a loss of dreams, loss of hopes, loss of goals. Right now, all these students that can't go back to school and can't go to graduation, they had a goal they were working for, getting to that graduation. Well, they've lost those goals. And all of us, had a goal for going to work every day, getting up and having our routines, and we've all lost our routines and many of our goals. We've had to change our goals. We've had to learn new ways to work and function, and so a lot of times we don't recognize that these are losses for people because they're not tangible. Loss of our mind, loss of mind. Yet, what by that I mean, we no longer are able to control our thoughts, our feelings, mental health issues, chemical imbalances in the brain. I want to be really clear. When I talk about mental health, I'm talking about the organ of the brain. Not talking about the mind. It's not out there. It's in here. It's in our head, and it's in our skulls. It is an organ. And so mind is brain. It's the same thing as brain. And when we can't control our brain, our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, because our brain is ill, that is a loss. But a lot of time people don't see that. They might see that our behaviors are different, or they might see that our thoughts are difficult, or that our emotions are difficult, but then they blame us. They blame us for having those thoughts, having those feelings, doing those behaviors, not realizing that those are symptoms of a brain illness. So we really have a long way to go to teach our society about the organ of the brain. And taking care of the organ of the brain is very much like taking care of any other organ in our body. Good diet, exercise, except with the brain, you might want to think about not watching horror movies or negative things. Try watching a lot of comedy. Those are things that you may not think about with other organs, but that's definitely one we have to think about with the organ of the brain. Loss of culture, and I think Hawaiians can speak to this much better than I can, that, that is a loss. That is a loss of our identity, of our origins, of our story. So loss of culture can be a very difficult process because it's intangible. Intangible losses often go unrecognized, and there's no way to process them with others. And of course, what we know is that when we're grieving, we need other people. So loss of connections. Right now, we're having to stay home. Right. We're not able to connect with people out there and to be able to visit our friends, go see our family. So we kind of have the loss of connections with other people. And staying home is really creating that sense of loss in us. And we may not recognize it's primarily because of the numerous losses that we're having, tangible and intangible. Loss of roles. This is a difficult one because we play roles in our life. A mother is a role, but she's also a wife. She's also a daughter. She's also a worker or friend. She has many roles in her life. But let's say when a parent dies, then that woman, when her mother dies, she loses that role of daughter. And we don't often realize that that's a loss and that needs to be grieved. So the loss of roles can be very difficult. It is an intangible loss, and again, those are the hardest sometimes because we don't get support from other people who don't recognize those losses. They might see that, yes, you've lost a mother, but they're not going to recognize you've lost the role of being a daughter too.
Christian's watching.
Oh, hi,
Christian,
Christian.
that's kind of. Are you flying? Hope not.
Not while he's watching, no.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about disenfranchised loss. This isn't a term you may hear very often, but I think it's important to understand in terms of grief that it's a term describing grief that is not acknowledged by society. Examples of events leading to disenfranchised grief are often death of a friend, the loss of a pet, a trauma in the family, a generation prior. So, for example, let's say your grandmother had a trauma and was in some way debilitated by that. That's going to affect your mother, and it's going to affect you. But we don't often get to grieve those disenfranchised losses because there's no acknowledgement in society for those losses. The loss of a home or place of residence, particularly in the case of children. Children feel this the most, I think, who generally have little or no control in such situations and whose grief may not be noticed or understood by caregivers. And that's typical. We often don't notice that children are grieving or understand that what you're seeing is part of their grief process. American military children and families in particularly move a great deal while growing up, and so they're going to have a lot of those disenfranchised losses and need that support to grieve. An abortion or miscarried pregnancy can be a loss. People don't recognize it. They don't acknowledge that that's significant loss often in our society. A mother's loss or surrender of a child to adoption. And they're like, well, you chose to give up that child. Why are you grieving? So, that's often disenfranchised by society. Even a child's loss of their birth mother through adoption. So that can be a loss. Even if they didn't know that mother, they know they were adopted. And yes, children should know that they were adopted. And because, first of all, you want to establish an open communication with them around that so that if they are struggling, if they are having difficulties, you can address that together and support them through that. The death of a loved one due to socially unacceptable causes such as suicide or the death of a celebrity. So there's just a lot of disenfranchised losses that happen in people's lives that society doesn't often recognize. So let's talk about types of grief. One type of grief is wait, what happened to my thing?
You say complete.
There it is. Yeah. Okay. Uncomplicated grief. Normal, healthy process that needs support. Grief is a normal, healthy process. It doesn't need therapy or counseling. It needs support. As a matter of fact, some very powerful studies have found that grief counseling can actually make things worse. I know that's surprising. Grief counseling isn't really something that people need when they're having a healthy grief process. They need support, and support is different from counseling. If you want more information about that, let me know. I can bring it up in our future presentations. Multiple losses. Oh, then let's go to complicated grief before I go there. Yeah. Complicated grief. Now, grief is a very stressful process, and complicated grief is an unhealthy consequence of the stress of grieving, and it does need more than support. It often needs can lead to serious issues and require evaluation or even medications. So let's look at some of the factors that contribute to a complicated grief process, keeping in mind most grief processes are healthy and uncomplicated. So if there's a complication, you need to know and seek additional resources. A sudden and anticipated loss can lead to complications. So that's going to be we've known families where a parent died from asthma or heart failure. A homicide is sudden. A suicide is sudden. A car crash is sudden. These things can complicate the grief process primarily because it overwhelms our coping mechanisms. We're not ready for it. And other kinds of deaths like illness, we can prepare ourselves a little bit. You never know how you're going to react though. Grief is an individual process. I did hospice work for 10 years and I learned very quickly, I think in my first year, that you can't really prepare somebody for how they're going to react when a family member or loved one dies. You just don't know until it happens. You can, you might know that they're going to die, but you may not know necessarily when or how you're going to feel about it. So I think I ended up clicking on, here we go. Let's go back. Did I cover everything on no. Let's talk about multiple losses. A lot of times people lose more than one person. Also, self-blame can be a complication of grief. A troubled relationship with the deceased, for example, if somebody dies and you had an argument, that can be a complication. If you had a bad relationship with somebody and then they die, that can lead to complications.
Yeah. I hear like a kid say, I want you to be dead or something, like that kind
Out
of
of
thing.
anger.
And then said, then this really happened. Then that's gonna.
So it's important to know these things, and going to a support group like Kids Hurt Too Hawaii offers allows children a chance to process that and talk about that and communicate that, because a lot of times they have similar experiences and feelings. And then again, children often also might blame themselves for death, and that can be a real complication. Trauma in addition to grief. So you can have trauma without grief. You can have grief without trauma, but if you have them both, then that can create complications that might cause brain dysfunction, health difficulties. Are there any questions, Hiro?
Nope.
Don't? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on then.
Yeah.
A sense of helplessness. Sometimes I have found this to be a very common thing that, a person may have spent 24 hours a day caring for a family member and a loved one, and they may have exhausted themselves providing for that person. And in their deepest heart, they wish they could do whatever is possible to prolong their life, to keep them there. And then the person dies and they feel very helpless because you can't stop death. Some of these losses you can't prevent, especially if you're a child. They're going to happen and it's out of your control. And that sense of helplessness can be a real difficult thing to cope with. It can also suggest that there's a brain chemical imbalance that might be contributing to the complication. Violent death, previous mental health issues, previous relationship issues. People often say that a death will, if you had difficulties in your marriage before and a child dies, that you'll come together. Not necessarily. Just like a previous mental health issues, if you had difficulties before the loss, after a loss, those difficulties are probably going to be much worse and get worse over time. So previous mental health issues can actually worsen after a loss, and loss is not necessarily death. Remember that. Loss is change. So in some of these losses can be tangible, some can be intangible. Just keep that in mind. Lack of social supports. You know, back in the old days, way back when, a person died at home very often and they had family around them, and the community came together to support one another. A person wore black so others knew they were grieving and could relate to them on the level of their grief. Nowadays, we often don't know what's going on in somebody else's life. We don't know if they're grieving. We don't know what they've suffered. And so they might be suffering alone and they don't have a support system that will help them through that grief process. So lack of support can be a real issue. Open communication is a factor in a healthy grief process. Closed communication is a factor in a complicated grief process or an unhealthy grief process. The more open that families can communicate, the better that child or adult is going to cope with the loss. So open communication is a real key. The number of changes after a loss, the more changes, the more likely a person's going to have a complicated grief process. And then, of course, shame or self-hatred, and those are typically a consequence of trauma. It could be from other issues, but that will contribute to a complicated grief process. There. There we go. Sorry, you got to see that little tiny thing. So now let's talk about some historical perspectives on theories of grief, because, you know, we really didn't even start studying grief until, well, Sigmund Freud was the first to actually study it. And some of those studies over time developed into stage theories. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself came out with the stages of dying. There were 5 stages of dying that she had identified in her work with dying people. And then we didn't really have a lot to go on back in those days, so people took from her theory and they applied it to grief. Now, I studied with Kubler-Ross back in the 80s, and she herself would say that's not how she intended for it to be used. And so she was not happy about the fact that people were using her stages of dying to talk about grief. She criticized that a great deal, but it is attributed to her. There are 4-stage theories, 5-stage theories, 7-stage theories. You know, stage theories meant that, you know, you were supposed to experience this, or this, or this, or this, or this. So I have been in this field for 37 years. And so I've taught all the theories. You know, back in the early 80s, what we taught was stages. And I found very quickly in my work as a grief support person that using stages was not beneficial to my clients, because they felt that they should be going through this process step by step by step, and if they weren't, there was something wrong with them, or they were failing in some way. And so I thought, no, we need to know there's something else. And I think a lot of people felt that. So phase theories then developed, because we realized it's not just an orderly fashion that grief is progressing in. There's differences, there's shifting, there are, you know, they overlap sometime, but, you know, we can't really define when they begin, when they end, you know. So we came out with phase theories, and there were 4 phases, and by Collin and Parks and Bowlby and Parks or Collin, yeah. Anyway, phase theories didn't last very long before we actually got into task theories. William Worden actually came out with them in his book on grief counseling, and he kind of looked at the task of grief was something that you do. It was an active process, and they were tasks, and then they came out with 6 tasks. First he had 4, then he had 6, and then there was 5 tasks, and there were lots of different task theories. The one thing that all of these stage, phase, and task theories had in common was that they had a beginning and an end. So grief started here at the point of loss, and then it progressed to an end.
Linear.
And it was a linear model. That's right. You know, that people were expected to get over it, to complete their grief process. But we learned very quickly through our studies that people don't get over it. Grief never ends. And then, the more recently, in the 90s, the theory of continuing bonds came out by Class. And that really was more of acknowledging some of the more indigenous approaches to the grief process, that capacity to stay connected to who is lost, our ability to honor those connections and those bonds. And again, however, the continuing bonds theory kind of had the same kind of, but you have to disengage that connection from that person and reinvest your energy somewhere else. It didn't fully address the needs, but it was a step in the right direction, and I felt really excited about the continuing bonds theory, and I taught that for many years, and still, focus on that. Now at Kids Hurt 2 Hawaii, our approach is based on the quantum model of grief work that I myself have developed over 37 years of doing work with children primarily, and I think that children have taught me a lot about how they grieve and what they need when they're grieving. And I call it the quantum model of grief work because it focuses on energy and the exchange of energy. And when you work with children, you work with a lot of energy. And we'll talk about that in the third session of our series on grief. And I'll go into that in detail next time as well.
Yeah. The Sasaichi-san, my sister Anna is watching,
Oh,
and then
hi,
Hajime-san said, "Oh, Cynthia, thank you so much, but so hard to understand English, so that's hard for him."
Sorry.
Okay.
Wish I could have Hero translate for me while I'm doing this, but
no.
then it'd be 2 hours.
Yeah, right.
So let's go back to the beginning and talk about development and grief. Grief grows as you grow. It is not something you get over. Grief never ends. That's a quote from a child that went to the Dougie Center.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've learned from children that grief grows as you grow. When you lose a parent, let's say you lose a mother at 3, a child will grieve. You were 2.
Right.
The loss of mom's not there to walk me to school or to make my lunch or to give me a bath or read me a story. And then when they're 6, they have a different issue. Mom's not there to take them to school and to make their lunch for school and to help with the homework. And then when they go to high school, mom's not there to help me pick out a dress for prom. Mom's not there to talk to me about boys or help me understand boys. Mom's not there to see me graduate from high school. You get married. Mom's not there for the wedding. You have children. Mom's not there to be a grandmother. You grow old, and your mom's not there to teach you how to grow old. So grief is for a lifetime. So the more connected you are to who you lost, the more that grief will grow with you. There are, however, and this is a lot of information, I'll probably have to put my glasses on if I'm going to go through it, but there are a lot of differences in terms of how a grief process manifests developmentally, and I am going to put my glasses on for that. So first of all, children ages 2 to 4, they have this concept of the reversibility of death. They see death as not permanent, but as an abandonment. They think the person will come back, and they don't understand that death is permanent. Young children are egocentric. They believe the world centers around them, and in some cases, it really does. And they might be focused on themselves. They don't have a cognitive understanding of death, especially. Their grief is physical and preconceptual, so they're unable to grasp those concepts. Now, this has to do actually with the size of the brain more than it has to do with their age. Because what research found was that when your brain gets to a certain size, then you're able to understand abstract concepts a little better. So children grow at different rates, of course, and they're going to understand things differently as they grow and develop. So that's an important part to understand. And it's based, a lot of times we think children don't know what's going on, but they do. Or they don't understand, but they do at their level. And that's why it's important to keep that open communication so that you can know how they are understanding the loss in their life. So their grief can be very physical, very intense, and very present-oriented. I just want to talk to you about the fact that grief, like trauma, is in your body. It's not in the past. It's not about what happened 20 years ago or 10 years ago. It's about what you're experiencing right now, right here in this moment. It is in the body, and so grief is very present because our bodies are present. So children have a tendency to be very grieve very much in the present moment. So a lot of times they'll say really deep, profound things in the moment, and we'll think, oh, they must have been thinking about this for days, but actually it just popped into their head because that's how they're feeling in that moment. Adults, we can think about things in abstract and bring it up later, but children, they're in the moment. They're living in the moment. And so it's important for us to be in that moment with them. They might ask questions over and over again. Their signs of distress might be regression, changes in eating and sleeping patterns, bedwetting, especially for young children, and general irritability and confusion. When children are sad or depressed especially, that's a chemical imbalance in the brain. Depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain, okay, that can be caused from stress, the stress of grief, from trauma, from a lot of different things, genetics, but that presents in young children as irritability. A lot of times we think it's sadness or they look morose or down, but actually it's more they're angry or fighting or irritable. So interventions then are short and based on how we interact. We have to answer those questions over and over again, and that can be really hard for adults, who are just heartbroken themselves, and it's really hard to answer those questions. But that nurturing, that consistent routine, that kind of provide them with that continuous comfort that they need when they're grieving. So they don't want to sleep alone. They can't have the light off. That's okay. It's okay if they sleep with you. Don't worry about it. They will grow out of it. Maybe not till they're 12, but they will grow out of it. So you have to honor them where they're at. And sorry about that. Children 4 to 7, now they start to gain a sense of autonomy and exploring the world, and their language is deeper, their fantasy thinking becomes more complex, and wishful thinking happens. This is an initiative phase, seeing themselves as the initiator. They can make things happen, and sometimes they might feel guilt, irrational guilt, like it's their fault that the person died, or they might blame themselves because they think they did something. I had a child I worked with once, and she thought that her mother had died because she borrowed her scarf, because that morning she borrowed her scarf without asking and wore it to school, and then the mother died while she was away, and she blamed herself because she thought if she hadn't taken that scarf, maybe her mother hadn't died. So this is another reason why open communication is really important, because you need to know when children are having thoughts that might not be healthy for them, that, you know, might require some more information to help them think more clearly. One child was blaming himself because his father was killed, and he thought, well, if I had just been there, I could have done something. I could have saved him. Or if I had done this or had done that. And you can't tell children not to think the way they think. You can't say, oh, you're wrong. You know, don't feel guilty. Don't feel this way. That's not helpful. But you can give them new information and give them comfort when they're feeling those difficult feelings. You can listen and support them as they're working through that. One thing I learned from children is that they will work through it. And they need to know that you're there and won't be judging them for how they're thinking or how they're feeling. And so we as adults have to be really careful about how we judge children's feelings or thoughts, you know, to listen, to accept. If it's unsafe, yes, you might need to say, no, this is what happened, not that. But only if it's unsafe. Otherwise, just hear what they have to say and how they're feeling, and be open and give them the freedom to be able to be open to. 4 to 7 year old death seems reversible. They kind of get the aha. They're not coming back. You mean they're gone and they're never going to come back? So that's going to usher in a new way of grieving, a new process for them. They verbalize more. They ask a lot of how and why questions. Their questions tend to be repetitive because they're trying to wrap their brain around why has this happened and how did it happen, and yeah, they just need to be heard. That they will grow out of that too. They again might regress. They may have nightmares or sleeping and eating problems. Their play might be violent. You know, when we worked in Japan with some of the children who lost family members through the tsunami, one child was playing tsunami. He was piling all of his toys and piling them and going, tsunami, tsunami's coming. And the grandmother who was caring for him said, oh, don't do that. But it was okay. We said play is their way of processing, and it's their way of understanding and taking on those roles. And they are just roles that will give them the power to move forward. So their play sometimes can have themes that relate to what happened to the person who died or the losses that they've had. And they might tend to take on the role, I'm the man of the house now if dad died, you know, and that's something you want to be careful about too, because you need to let them be children. Say, you're not the man of the house. You know, we don't have the dad here, your dad here, but I am in charge and you are a child, and it's okay to be a child. So we've seen too many children come into our program that have grown up too fast because they think they have to be the man of the house. Their play becomes more symbolic. They do a lot of drawings, and they'll act out and express their energy through play, and some of the themes in their play will help us understand more about how they're grieving and the process that they're going through. And then they get to be 7 and 11, and they start thinking, and thank you for timing me here.
Yep.
That's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to go over 1 hour, so
Okay.
I'll move on.
Just checking.
Yeah, thank you. So concrete thinking, what does that mean? That means you can understand what you can touch, taste, see, hear, feel, smell. Those are concrete. Those, you know, so if you can't touch it, taste it, feel it, see it, taste it, smell it, then it's abstract. Okay. So concrete thinking is very common for this age, and they become more social. And so Kids Hurt Too, our groups are for 3-year-olds and up. So yes, 3-year-olds can process and talk about their grief. We don't do it for under 3 because we're a group model, and children under 3 tend to do parallel play instead of group play, and we don't really have the capacity for individual one-on-one kinds of activities. But we do allow those younger children to come, and they can sit in with the parents group, and we provide toys for them as well. And sometimes if they're a little bit more mature,
kid.
yeah, then we'll let them in the program
Like
before
with
they
the
turn
siblings.
3.
With the siblings.
Yeah, if they have
Usually mature.
siblings, and but that capacity to play in groups is typically happening around 3, and so our program is primarily focused on that age group. Death is seen for these 7 to 11-year-olds as punishment, or they start to have fear of bodily harm or mutilation. They become kind of obsessed with what happens to the body after death. It can be a real difficult period, and they can ask some really hard questions of adults who might be shocked, by those questions. But again, just be open and honest. Try to give them the right information, keep them informed, provide them with resources. They want a lot more details about what happened and how it happened. They just start to have the ability to mourn in a different way and understand their feelings better. Again, for the younger children, grief is pre-verbal. It's a sensation in their body. It's not something they can just put into words, but they put into actions, and they show us through their behavior how they're grieving, not always through their talking. And when they start to get a little bit older, then they can tell us what's happening in their bodies that they're feeling, or they don't know what it means, or they can tell us about their sadness, or they can tell us what they're missing. But younger children, they just feel it in their body. It's a sensation. They don't have words for it. And so we often think they're okay and they're not grieving, but they are. They just don't know how to tell you, and they just feel it in their body, so they act it out, and this can be a problem because those behaviors might get punished or criticized or misunderstood. Now, the 7 to 11-year-old group, they can show regression too. Regression often is a sign that children are going back to a younger time when they felt safe and they had what they needed. So they regress back to that time, and that really allows them to bring that sense of safety and fulfillment forward to their current age. So we often encourage regression. We often see it as a positive thing and want to support it. A lot of times children get criticized or punished for their regression, but we recognize that regression is a healthy process for many children. Older children might show problems in school. They get teased a lot. Unfortunately, children in school can say some really harsh things, and so they're going to have more difficulties, and they may get into complicated grief because they might get bullied. A lot of times grieving children who had a parent die or parents divorce, they get bullied around that, and that's really hard for kids. So answer their questions, encourage their expressions. And then when they become teens, they start to become abstract thinkers, and they have deeper questions, and grief becomes a part of their personality. I know a lot of teens talk about finding value in things they didn't value before, realizing who their friends really are. They start to have demonstrate a greater compassion and sensitivity to other people as a result of their own grief. They can have difficulties as well because adolescence itself is a process of change. We often don't recognize that process itself is a grieving process, and they're changing very rapidly. And so there's a higher chance of complications of grief during that time. So encourage them, support them, take them seriously, give them some sense of control in their lives. Control is empowering, and just let children know that you're there and you care, and that you are going to answer their questions honestly, and that you're going to be available to them whenever they need you. So we just want to say thank you for listening.
Yeah.
We're happy you could join us today, and we look forward to giving you more information. Next time we're going to talk about the quantum model of grief, and then after that we're going to talk about how you can work directly with children and how you can support them in a very powerful and profound way. Were there any other questions that we need to be aware of?
No. Just Anna, my sister. Just thanks for the the lecture and proud of
There's a
us.
question.
And, now TJ, it's over 1 hour. But what do you think?
What's
How
the question?
do I deal with grief when we see reminders of them in the house that we are stuck inside of all day?
That's a good question. And it's important to recognize that reminders can be helpful. So talk about those reminders. When children see the pictures or they see the items that belong to somebody that they're missing, talk about what that meant to that person that they're missing, or talk about how they can be a support, or they can connect to whoever they're missing and continue that bond.
Continue on
So
memories.
objects are very helpful for conversations around grief and loss. So anytime there are objects, they can be very useful to you and to children for that, creating that open communication. And I think that's the real key, is open communication. So again, thank you for joining us, and I think that's all of our questions today.
Keep the memories alive.
Keep the memories alive.
Yeah, otherwise they forget. Yeah, that's another loss.
It doesn't help to forget. It helps to remember, and to remember together, because you may have different memories, and then your memories can become my memories because you shared them with me. Also remember, speaking of memories, that even infants grieve. Grief does not discriminate by age. We all are grievers in this life, and we all need to support one another in a time of loss, and we can be a real resource. Thank you for joining us. Aloha.
Thank you.